"This is my daughter," a man snarls in the alley. Mountain man Abel Kincaid turns. He sees the pillar of the town, his hand raised to strike the terrified girl cowering at his feet. Kincaid sees a detail, old bruises beneath the new mark. He takes one silent step, and the law of the mountain is about to replace the law of the town. In the territory of 1877, civilization was little more than a word whispered in dusty streets. For Dry Gulch, that word was a lie. The town huddled in the basin, baked by a relentless sun. But for 18-year-old Livia Stone, the heat of the day was nothing compared to the cold shadow cast by her own home. Life was not measured in seasons, but in the careful, silent steps she took on the floorboards of her father's house. She was a ghost in her own life, a creature of dust motes and silence, taught that her only value was in being unseen and unheard. Her father, Malachi Stone, was a pillar of their small, frightened community. He owned the town's mercantile, the one that held the monopoly on flour, salt, and survival. To the townsfolk, he was Mr. Stone, a man of firm handshakes and ledger books, always ready with a pious quote or a judgment on the failings of others. But pillars cast long, dark shadows. Inside the neat, whitewashed house that stood behind the mercantile, Malachi ruled not with a booming voice, but with a chilling, calculated silence. His displeasure wasn't shouted. It was delivered in the sudden grip of a hand on an arm, in a meal overturned for being a minute too late, in the cold appraisal of his eyes that stripped Livia of all worth. His tyranny was one of quiet, unpredictable cruelty. The bruises on her arms, hidden beneath long sleeves even in the sweltering heat, were a testament to his control. The town of Dry Gulch saw, of course. They saw her flinch when her father approached. They saw the hollows in her cheeks and the terror in her eyes. But they were beholden to Malachi Stone. They owed him for their powder, their seed, their very existence. And so, they turned their gaze aside, convincing themselves that the affairs of the Stone family were private, that a man's home was his castle, even if it was a dungeon for his only child. But above the basin, above the reach of Malachi Stone's ledger book, lived a different kind of man. High in the timberline, where the air was sharp and the world was honest, lived Abel Kincaid. The people of Dry Gulch spoke of him in whispers, calling him Grizzly Kincaid, a name born of both respect and fear. They saw him as a myth, a wild man who had turned his back on God and society. But they were wrong. Abel Kincaid had not retreated from the world in fear. He had left it in search of sanity. He had seen what men called civilization, the greed, the hypocrisy, the casual cruelty, and found it lacking. He chose the silence of the aspens and the brutal, unwavering honesty of the winter snow. He lived by a simple, natural law, one he had learned from the wild itself. The truly strong do not oppress the weak. His cabin, built from the rock and pine of the mountain itself, was a fortress of solitude. He understood the rhythm of the peaks, the language of the wind, and the unwritten contract of the wilderness. He was a man forged not by society's weak compromises, but by the unyielding strength of the earth. Kincaid's journeys into Dry Gulch were rare, driven only by the pressing need for essentials he could not hunt or forge himself: salt, powder, steel traps. Each descent was a mission, a quick, silent intrusion into a world he despised. He would tie his mule behind the blacksmith's, trade his perfect pelts for his goods, and be gone before the dust of his arrival had settled. It was on such a day, with the sky threatening a late summer storm, that fate finally drew its line. Kincaid was finishing his trade at the mercantile, his presence filling the store, making the other customers nervous. Malachi Stone was all false smiles and obsequious gestures, weighing out salt with a heavy hand, eager to be rid of the mountain man's unsettling presence. Kincaid paid, his eyes as cold and gray as the granite peaks he called home. He nodded once, a gesture of transaction, not of fellowship, and turned to leave. He was almost to his mule when the wind shifted. It carried the scent of ozone and pine, but it also carried something else. A sound that did not belong. A muffled cry. A desperate pleading gasp, cut short by the sharp crack of a hand striking flesh. It came from the narrow, trash-filled alley between the Mercantile and the saloon. Kincaid froze. This was the sound of the corruption he had fled. The sound of a wolf cornering a fawn, not for hunger, but for sport. The other townsfolk hurried by, pulling their collars tight, their eyes fixed on the boardwalk. They did not want to hear it. But Abel Kincaid was not built to ignore it. He had spent a decade listening to the mountain, and it had taught him that innocence had a right to protection. Slowly, silently, he turned from his mule and walked toward the alley. He moved with a predator's grace, making no sound, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. What he saw there, in that sliver of darkness, broke the long peace of his isolation. He saw Malachi Stone, his face no longer a pillar of the community but a mask of sneering rage, his hand raised again, and cowering against the wall, her thin dress torn, was Livia. The mountain man, who had sworn off the affairs of men, found himself at a crossroads. The law of the town was silent. The law of the mountain demanded he act. Malachi Stone did not hear Abel Kincaid approach. The only warning he had was the sudden plunge of the alley into a deeper shadow, as if the sun itself had been blocked. He turned, his hand still raised, his mouth open to deliver another venomous word, and the sound died in his throat. Abel Kincaid stood at the alley's mouth, a solid wall of buckskin and muscle. He was not a tall man, but his breadth filled the space, and he seemed to draw the very shadows to him. He held no weapon. His hands were open at his sides. But his presence was an accusation, a physical weight that pressed the air from Malachi's lungs. The mountain man's eyes were the color of a winter storm, and they were fixed on Malachi's raised hand. Malachi, for the first time in his life, felt the icy grip of real fear. This was not a townsperson he could indebt, not a wife he could browbeat. This was a man who lived outside his rules, who survived by his own strength, and whose silence was more terrifying than any threat. Malachi's arm wavered and then dropped to his side. He tried to muster his civic dignity. "This is a private matter," he blustered, his voice a thin imitation of its usual authority. "This is my daughter. You have no business here, Kincaid. Get back to your hovel." Kincaid took one step into the alley. The sound of his moccasin on the hard-packed dirt was almost silent, yet it echoed louder than Malachi's shout. He did not look at Malachi. His gaze shifted to Livia, who was pressed so hard against the brick wall she seemed to be trying to merge with it. She was trembling, her eyes wide, staring at him as if he were an apparition. He saw the raw, red mark on her cheek. He saw the geography of old, faded bruises on her neck. He saw the hollow terror that had carved a home in her features. And in that moment, his quiet neutrality fractured. He had seen predators in the wild, had seen the clean, honest kill. This was different. This was corruption. This was a rot that had no place in the natural order. He turned his eyes back to Malachi. He still said nothing. He simply held the man's gaze, and in that look, Malachi saw his entire, petty kingdom of fear collapse. The mountain man was judging him, and by a law older than any ledger book, he had been found wanting. She is disobedient," Malachi stammered, taking a step back. "She requires a firm hand. The good book itself says." Kincaid took a second step. He was close enough now that Malachi could smell the pine and wood smoke on him, the scent of a world that would not bend. The storekeeper's back hit the opposite wall. His bluster was gone, replaced by the pale, clammy sweat of a coward unmasked. Abel Kincaid finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but it was rough, like gravel rattling over stone. "You will not touch her again." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, the declaration of a new truth that had just been carved into the world. Malachi's eyes darted past Kincaid, looking for the sheriff, for any of the men who usually deferred to him. The alley was empty. The town had abandoned him. Kincaid turned his head, just slightly, back to Livia. He did not offer a smile or a hand. His face was still a harsh mask, but his voice, when he spoke to her, lost its hard edge. "You can come with me, or you can stay." That was all. A choice. It was the first real choice she had been offered in her entire life. She stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. To leave? To walk away from her father? The very idea was a sin, a rebellion so profound she could barely comprehend it. She looked at Malachi, who was watching her with a venomous promise in his eyes. She knew what awaited her the moment this mountain man turned his back, a punishment that would be silent and brutal and would last for days. Then she looked back at Kincaid. He was offering her nothing. No promises of safety, no kindness, just an escape. An arrow pointing away from this alley, away from this life. She felt a single, hot tear trace a path through the dust on her cheek. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she pushed herself off the wall. She did not run. She walked. Each step was a tiny, agonizing rebellion. She walked past her father, keeping her eyes on the granite-solid back of the mountain man. When she reached Kincaid's side, she was shaking so badly she could barely stand. He nodded once, a curt, small movement. He placed himself between her and the alley's mouth, a living shield. "If you follow us," he said to Malachi, his voice dropping back to that gravelly rumble, "the mountain will claim you." He then turned and walked into the street, not looking back, trusting that she would follow. Livia took a ragged breath and followed him. They walked, a strange pair, the wild man in buckskins and the girl in the torn dress, straight through the center of Dry Gulch. People stopped to stare. They saw Livia Stone, her face marked, walking with Grizzly Kincaid. They saw Malachi Stone emerge from the alley moments later, his face a mask of purple rage, his hands clenched, but he did not follow. He just watched them go, his humiliation a poison he could not spit out. Kincaid led her to his mule, untied it, and loaded his supplies. He didn't offer her a ride. He simply grunted and started walking, leading the mule by the rope, beginning the long, steady climb out of the basin. Livia followed, her thin shoes scrambling on the loose rock. The journey up the mountain was a blur of terror and exhaustion. The sun set, plunging the switchbacks into a treacherous gloom. Kincaid did not slow. He moved with a steady, relentless pace, his knowledge of the path so complete he didn't need light. Livia's lungs burned. Her legs, weak from years of confinement and poor nutrition, threatened to give out. She slipped, her hands scraping raw on the granite. She whimpered, a small, involuntary sound. Kincaid stopped. He turned, his form a dark silhouette against the rising moon. He looked at her for a long moment. She thought he would leave her. He had offered an escape, not a guarantee. But then he walked back, unhooked his canteen from the mule's saddle, and handed it to her. She drank, the water tasting of metal and earth, and it was the sweetest thing she'd ever known. He took it back, wordlessly. "We are almost there," he said. And he turned and continued his climb. Livia pulled herself to her feet and followed. When they finally reached the small plateau deep in the timberline, she was half dead, moving on pure, terrified instinct. She saw the dark shape of a cabin, a structure that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. Kincaid opened the door, and a warmth and the smell of old wood smoke and herbs spilled out. He gestured for her to enter. She hesitated on the threshold. One world behind her, another, unknown and terrifying, in front of her. He didn't rush her. He simply waited, his patience that of the mountain itself. Livia Stone took a trembling step and crossed the threshold, leaving her old life behind in the darkness below. Abel Kincaid's cabin was not a home. It was a den. It was a single room, built of massive, rough-hewn logs, chinked so tightly with mud and moss that not a sliver of moonlight could find its way through. The air inside was warm, dry, and smelled of pine resin, curing hides, and a faint, lingering scent of herbs. A low fire smoldered in a wide stone hearth, casting a deep amber glow over the room. There was no clutter. Every object had a purpose, a place. A thick plank table stood in the center, scrubbed clean. A set of shelves held tin plates, a few iron pots, and neatly stacked jars of dried herbs and roots. In one corner, a massive bed of furs was piled high, looking both warm and wild. In the other, a workbench was covered in tools she didn't recognize, awls, knives of various sizes, and strips of sinew. It was a place of absolute, unyielding function. It was the complete opposite of her father's house, which was filled with fussy, delicate furniture no one was allowed to touch, and spaces that were meant for display, not for living. Kincaid dropped his satchel of supplies onto the table with a heavy thud. The sound made her jump, a reflex she couldn't control. He saw her flinch, and his face tightened, but he said nothing about it. He moved to the hearth, added a log from a neatly stacked pile, and stoked the embers into a low flame. Livia remained by the door, her hands clenched at her sides, feeling small and out of place, a stray dog brought in from the storm. She didn't know the rules here. Every house had rules. Her father's rules were silent, numerous, and the punishment for breaking them was swift and painful. What were the rules of this wild man? "Sit," he said, gesturing not to the table, but to a low three-legged stool near the fire. She obeyed instantly, perching on the edge, her back rigid. He moved around the small space with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. He unpacked the salt, flour, and powder, storing each in its proper container. Then he took a heavy iron pot, ladled water into it from a covered wooden bucket, and hung it on a hook over the fire. He added a handful of dried meat and some chopped roots from a tin. He did all of this without a word, his movements sure and practiced. The silence in the cabin was profound. It wasn't the empty waiting silence of her father's house, which was always pregnant with the threat of his footsteps. This was a living, quiet, full of the sounds of the fire crackling, the wind moving through the high pines outside, and the faint, distant hoot of an owl. It was the sound of the world breathing, and it terrified her. She was used to noise, to the clatter of the street, to her father's sharp commands, to the constant, humming anxiety in her own head. This quiet left her with nothing but her own thoughts, and they were a dark, jumbled mess. Kincaid finished his task and turned to look at her. He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes unblinking in the firelight. He saw her torn dress, the raw scrapes on her hands, the exhaustion that made her tremble. He walked to the corner where the great pile of furs lay. He grabbed a thick bear hide, one so large it must have come from a creature of immense size, and a smaller, softer deerskin. He brought them over and dropped them on the floor, on the opposite side of the hearth from his own bed. "That is your space," he said. He then pointed to the covered bucket of water. "That is for drinking and cooking." He pointed to a wash basin on a dry sink. "That is for cleaning." He gestured to the shelves. "The food is not to be wasted. You eat what is cooked." His words were flat, declarative. He was not welcoming her. He was establishing the physical boundaries of her new existence, her space, her own place to sleep. The idea was so foreign, it took her a moment to understand. She had a room in her father's house, but it was not hers. He entered it as he pleased, rummaged through her things, left it in disarray as a reminder that nothing, not even her own thoughts, was private. This patch of floor, this pile of furs, it was hers. He would not cross into it. It was a line drawn in the dirt, and it was the first piece of solid ground she'd ever had. The stew began to bubble, and the smell of it, rich and savory, filled the cabin, making her stomach clench with a painful, desperate hunger. She realized she hadn't eaten since a piece of dry bread the previous morning. Kincaid took 2 tin bowls from the shelf, ladled a portion of the thick stew into each, and handed one to her, along with a wooden spoon. She took it, her hands shaking. She waited. At her father's table, she was not permitted to eat until he had taken his first bite and nodded his approval. Kincaid sat on his own stool, across the fire from her, and began to eat. He did not look at her or grant her permission. He simply ate. Livia stared at the steam rising from her bowl. She was free to eat. The realization was so stark, so simple, that it brought a fresh sting of tears to her eyes. She fought them back, furious at her own weakness, and quickly, almost guiltily, dipped her spoon in. The stew was hot, salty, and incredibly good. She ate it ravenously, the warmth spreading through her chilled body, a balm to her raw nerves. They ate in silence. When she was finished, she scraped the bowl clean, not a single drop wasted. Kincaid finished his, rose, and took her bowl from her hands. He cleaned them both in the wash basin, dried them, and put them back on the shelf. The simple, domestic act was so normal, yet so alien in this context, that she couldn't look away. Her father had never washed a dish in his life. He left his messes for her to clean, a constant, silent assertion of his dominance. Kincaid, it seemed, was responsible for himself. He looked back at her. The fire had warmed her. The food had given her a sliver of strength, but the trembling had not stopped. It was the deep, bone-bred tremor of shock and long-held terror. "The mountain is not like the town," he said, his voice quiet, making her start. It was the most he had said to her at one time. "It does not care about your past. It does not judge. But it is honest. It will kill you without malice if you are careless. It will feed you if you are smart. Here, you are not a daughter. You are not a victim." The word hung in the air, a label she had worn for so long she didn't know who she was without it. "Here," he continued, "you are just a living thing. Same as the hawk, same as the pine. You will learn to survive, or you will not. That is the only rule." He turned away, a clear dismissal. He went to his workbench and began mending a piece of tack, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy and precision. The conversation, such as it was over. Livia sat on her stool, the warmth of the fire on her face, the weight of his words settling on her. The only rule, not 1,000 shifting invisible laws designed to trap her, but one: survive. For the first time, she looked around the cabin not as a prison, but as a refuge. It was stark, yes, and the man who inhabited it was a stranger, as wild and unyielding as the granite peaks outside. But there was no malice here. There was no calculated cruelty. There was only the simple, brutal honesty of the mountain. She was safe. The thought was so new, so fragile, that she barely dared to breathe it. Safe. She looked at her pile of furs, her space. Slowly, her exhausted body screaming in protest, she moved from the stool and crawled onto the hides. The bear fur was thick and surprisingly soft, the deerskin beneath it supple. She pulled another hide over her, the weight of it a comfort, a heavy protective blanket. She lay on her side, facing the fire, and watched him work. His back was to her, his shoulders broad, his focus absolute as he stitched the leather. He was a protector, but not a gentle one. He was a force, like a rock wall that turns the wind. He had not saved her out of kindness. He had taken her in because his own nature, the law of the mountain he embodied, demanded it. Malachi Stone's cruelty was an imbalance, a sickness, and Abel Kincaid had, in his own way, restored the balance. Livia closed her eyes. The wind howled outside, a high, lonely sound. But inside the cabin, there was the crackle of the fire, the scrape of Kincaid's awl against leather, and the steady beat of her own heart. She was no longer a prisoner in her father's house. She was an inhabitant of the mountain, and for the first time in her 18 years of life, Livia Stone fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Livia woke with a violent gasp. her body rigid. For a disorienting second, she didn't know where she was. Then the scent of wood smoke and pine filled her nose, and the memory of the previous night rushed back. The alley, the climb, the man. Sunlight, bright and unfiltered, streamed through a small, square window set high in the wall. It was morning, late morning. A wave of ice-cold panic seized her. She had overslept. In her father's house, sleeping past dawn was an act of defiance, a sin of sloth that would earn her a day of starvation or worse. She scrambled from the warm cocoon of furs, her heart hammering, her eyes darting around the cabin, bracing for the impact of a hand, the hiss of her name. The cabin was empty. Abel Kincaid was gone. The fire in the hearth was built up, burning steadily, a pot of water warming beside it. But the man, his weapons, and his heavy coat were absent. A new, sharper terror replaced the first. He had abandoned her. Of course he had. He had rescued her on a whim, a moment of savage impulse, and now, in the cold light of day, he had regretted his decision. He had left her here to die, miles from a town she couldn't return to. She stumbled to the door, her hands fumbling with the unfamiliar wooden latch, and burst out into the blindingly bright mountain air. The cold was a shock, stealing her breath. She looked around wildly, her thin dress useless against the wind, and then she saw him. Not far, perhaps 30 yards from the cabin, standing in a small clearing. His back was to her. He was splitting wood, the rhythmic thwack of his axe echoing in the crisp air. He moved with a powerful, practiced grace, the maul rising and falling, bisecting massive rounds of pine as if they were kindling. He must have heard her, but he didn't stop. He finished the round he was working on, split the halves into quarters, and only then did he pause, wiping his brow on his sleeve. He turned and looked at her. He didn't scold her for sleeping. He didn't comment on her panicked state. He simply nodded once toward the cabin, then pointed to the large wooden bucket by the door. "The fire needs water," he said, and he turned back to his work. The routine began that day, unspoken but absolute. Abel Kincaid was not a gentle savior. He did not coddle her or soothe her fears. He was a teacher, and the mountain was his classroom. His lessons were delivered not in words, but in action, in tasks left for her to complete. He handed her the heavy bucket. "The creek is that way," he grunted, pointing into the trees. "Do not be seen." It took her 3 trips, slipping on the damp rocks, her weak arms burning to fill the larger cask inside the cabin. When she finished, he was back, dropping 2 gutted rabbits on the table. "Skin them," he said, and walked back out. She stared at the animals, her stomach churning. She had never prepared game, only cooked what her father bought and brought to her. She fumbled with the knife he had left. It was clumsy, bloody work, and she ruined the first pelt, tearing it with her inexpert cuts. She froze, the ruined skin in her hand, waiting for the inevitable explosion of rage. She remembered spilling a jar of molasses once. Her father hadn't let her eat for 2 days. Kincaid returned, took the poorly skinned rabbit from her, examined it, then looked at the second, untouched animal. "A ripped pelt keeps no one warm, but the meat still feeds," he said, his voice flat. "Do the second one. Mind the belly." He was not angry. It was not a moral failing. It was a practical problem, and the solution was to learn. She skinned the second rabbit. Her work was slow, but she did not tear the hide. When she finished, he took it, nodded once. "It's a start." He taught her to read the world he inhabited. He would take her into the deep woods. He wouldn't speak. He would simply stop, point to a bent twig, a disturbed patch of leaves. He would wait until she saw the faint, heart-shaped print of a deer. He would point to a specific type of moss, then to the north face of the trees. He was giving her a compass. One afternoon, he led her to one of his snares. It was empty, the loop of sinew broken. He looked at it, then at her. He reached into his pouch, pulled out a new coiled loop, and pressed it into her hand. Then he walked away, disappearing into the timber. She stood there for an hour, cold and frustrated, the small wire cutting into her palm. She looked at the broken snare, trying to understand the mechanism. She looked at the other, intact snares he had set nearby. She saw the way the loop was anchored, how the trigger was set. She tried, fumbling, her cold-numbed fingers clumsy. The loop wouldn't hold. She tried again, copying his work exactly. The trigger stick held. She backed away, proud and exhausted. When he returned at dusk, he checked her trap. He nudged the trigger with his boot. The loop snapped shut. He looked at her, and the barest hint of approval touched his eyes. "You'll eat tomorrow," he said. The rifle was the hardest part. He led her to a clearing, set a tin can on a stump 50 yards away. He handed her the rifle. It was impossibly heavy, the metal cold, the wood oiled and smooth. "It's not a toy," he said. "It's a tool. It's the line between you and starvation, or you and a bear. You respect it." He showed her how to load, how to sight. She nestled the butt of the rifle against her shoulder as he'd shown, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The recoil was a brutal physical punch that knocked her clean off her feet, landing her hard in the dirt. Her shoulder screamed in agony. The can was untouched. Tears of pain and humiliation sprang to her eyes. She lay there, sobbing, the shame of her father's house washing over her. She was weak. She was useless. Kincaid stood over her, reloading the rifle. His face was implacable stone. "Tears won't stop a wolf," he said. "And you held it too loose. You let it hit you. Control it. Don't let it control you. Get up." Again. She got up, her entire body shaking. Her shoulder was a constellation of fire. She hated him. She hated the rifle. She hated the mountain. She raised the weapon, pulling it so tight into her shoulder she thought her bones might crack. She fired. The recoil still hurt, but it didn't knock her down. The bullet kicked up dirt 5 feet to the left of the can. "Again," he said. She fired again, and again. Her shoulder was a pulp of raw, purple bruising. It was an echo of her father's hand. But this was different. This was a pain with a purpose. This was a pain she was choosing. On the 10th shot, the can vanished from the stump, a spray of metal flashing in the sun. She lowered the rifle, her arms trembling. A grim, small smile touched Kincaid's lips. "Good," he said. "Now you know how to feed yourself." The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the empty, terrifying void of her first night. It was a shared quiet, filled with the rhythms of their work. They would sit by the fire at night, she mending her torn dress with a needle and thread he'd given her, he carving a new handle for his axe. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the scrape of his knife on the wood. It was comfortable. It was peace. One night, the past returned. She was asleep, deep in her furs. When the nightmares found her, she was back in the alley, her father's face above her, his hand raised, the smell of whiskey and rage in the air. She woke with a strangled scream, sitting bolt upright, her heart trying to claw its way out of her chest. "No! Father! Please!" The cabin was dark. The fire burned to low embers. In a second, a match scraped, and the oil lamp flared, casting a warm, steady glow. Abel Kincaid was sitting on his stool, his own bed undisturbed. He hadn't been asleep. He was just watching the fire. He didn't rush to her. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady. "You are here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He is not." He picked up a large whetstone and his skinning knife. He began to sharpen the blade, the rhythmic, scraping, shing, shing, shing. A steady, abrasive, wonderful sound. It was the sound of a man at work. A man who was calm. A man who was present. It was an anchor in the storm of her panic. She watched him, her breathing ragged, her tears slowing. He was the opposite of her father. Malachi's strength was for breaking. Abel's was for building. His presence was a fortress wall, and he was sitting guard. She lay back down, her heart still pounding, but the terror receding. The sound of the blade on the stone was the sound of protection. She was here. He was not. She fell back asleep, not to nightmares, but to the sound of her guardian sharpening his knife. The first deep snow of the season came early, a heavy, wet blanket that muffled the world in a profound silence. For a week, they were prisoners of the storm, but it was a comfortable confinement. The rhythm of their life was set by the needs of survival: wood, water, food. But in the lulls, something else was growing. Livia found herself watching him, this quiet, solid man. She saw the way his hands, so powerful when splitting oak, could be gentle as he stitched a tear in his moccasin. He never offered kindness, not in the way the townsfolk understood it, with soft words or pitying looks. His kindness was in the firewood he stacked for her, in the extra blanket he tossed on her furs, in the fact that he never, ever raised his voice. He had given her a new name for the tasks he set. He called them lessons in honesty. The mountain, he said, was the only honest thing he knew. It never pretended to be safe, it never hid its intentions. Livia was checking the snares she had moved and reset herself, proud of the way the loops held, hidden and waiting. Abel was checking his own traps further up the ridge. She was alone, but for the first time in her life, she was not afraid. The cold air was sharp in her lungs, and she felt a strange new strength in her legs, a solidness that came from the climb. She was rebaiting the last snare when the silence of the woods changed. It was not a sound, but the absence of sound. The chattering of a squirrel in a nearby pine had stopped. The wind, which had been whispering through the spruce, seemed to be holding its breath. She froze. "Do not be seen," he had told her. She scanned the trees, her eyes trying to pierce the heavy shadows. Nothing. She told herself it was her imagination. She was still a town girl, spooked by the quiet. She turned back to her task, and a twig snapped, loud as a rifle shot in the still air. She rose slowly, and then she saw it. Not 20 yards away, half hidden by a curtain of hemlock, a cougar. It was long, pale, and emaciated, its ribs showing starkly. It was not the healthy, cautious predator of summer. This was a creature made desperate by hunger and the early snow. It was stalking her. Its yellow eyes were fixed on her, and its tail twitched once, twice, in agitation. This was not the honest mountain Abel spoke of. This was a hungry, malicious thing. Livia's blood turned to ice. Her father's face flashed in her mind, the sneer, the raised hand. She was trapped. She was prey. The cat let out a low, guttural growl and took a slow, deliberate step from the cover of the trees. Livia screamed. But the sound that tore from her throat was not the choked, muffled gasp from the alley. It was not a plea. It was a raw, primal shriek of defiance, a warning, a challenge. It was the sound of a living thing that would not go quietly. She fumbled for the heavy skinning knife Abel had insisted she carry, her hand so cold it barely obeyed. The cat gathered its powerful haunches, preparing to spring. No! The roar that split the air did not come from her. It came from the ridge. Abel K. Kincaid was moving, crashing through the snow-laden brush, his face a mask of terrible, controlled fury. He was running, his rifle in his hands, but he was too far. The cat launched itself. Livia threw herself backwards, falling into the deep snowdrift, the knife held uselessly in front of her. The cat landed where she had been a second before, its claws digging into the empty snow. It recovered instantly and turned on her. But in that same instant, Abel was there. He didn't try to aim. He couldn't. She was too close. He did something that defied all sanity. He roared, a sound that was not human but pure, bestial rage, and threw himself between her and the predator. He didn't use his rifle as a gun. He used it as a club, swinging the heavy stalk in a brutal arc that connected with the cat's shoulder. The animal shrieked, a sound of pain and surprise, and turned its fury on the larger threat. It was a blur of claws and teeth. The cougar was on him, raking, tearing. Abel bellowed, as long claws ripped through his heavy winter coat and buckskin, tearing deep into the flesh of his left arm and shoulder. He wrestled the beast, trying to bring the muzzle of his rifle to bear, but they were too close, locked in a desperate, primal struggle. Livia watched, frozen in the snow, as the man who had saved her was being torn apart. Tears won't stop a wolf. His words, control it. Don't let it control you. She scrambled to her feet. Her father's beatings had taught her to cower, to become small. The mountain was teaching her to fight. She looked around wildly, for a weapon, for anything. Her eyes landed on the heavy branch of a dead pine, half buried in the snow. It was thick as her leg. She grabbed it, her new strength surging, and she charged, screaming, "Get away from him!" She brought the heavy limb down on the cougar's back. The wood connected with a sickening crack. The animal shrieked, its spine injured, but it was not done. It twisted, disengaging from Abel, and lunged at her. Abel, on one knee, blood streaming down his arm, finally had his opening. The rifle exploded, the sound a flat, deafening crack in the enclosed woods. The cougar convulsed in midair and fell, its charge ending at Livia's feet. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. Livia stood, the heavy branch still in her hands, her body shaking so violently she thought her bones would come apart. Abel Kincaid was on the ground, leaning against a tree, his rifle in the snow. His left arm was a ruin of shredded cloth and blood. So much blood, steaming in the cold air. "Abel?" she whispered. He looked at her. His face was pale, drawn with pain, but his eyes were sharp. "Is it dead?" "Yes," she said, her voice a reedy gasp. "Good," he grunted. He tried to push himself up, but his left arm was useless, and the effort made him hiss in pain. "Help me up, girl!" The dynamic, the entire world, shifted on its axis. He was not the unshakable mountain. He was a man, bleeding in the snow. She dropped the branch and rushed to him, her terror for herself forgotten, replaced by a new, sharp, piercing fear for him. She put her small shoulder under his good arm, and he leaned on her. His weight was immense, solid, and he groaned as he stood. "The cabin," he said, his voice strained. "We need to get to the cabin." The walk back was a living nightmare. He leaned on her, each step a jarring agony for him. She felt his warm blood soaking through her own thin sleeve. She, who had been too weak to carry a bucket of water without trembling, was now bearing the weight of the mountain man. She did not falter. She did not stumble. Her fear gave her a cold, clear strength. She got him inside. The last few feet a desperate half-drag. He collapsed onto his stool by the fire, his head hanging, his breathing ragged. The wound was worse than she thought. 4 deep gashes from shoulder to elbow, leaking his life onto the floor. "The kit?" he panted, nodding to a wooden box on the high shelf. "The green jar. Yarrow powder." She moved, her hands finally steady. She brought the kit. She brought the wash basin. She cut away the shreds of his shirt. He winced, his jaw tightening, but he let her. She washed the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle, her focus absolute. She poured the yarrow powder, an herb he had shown her just last week, into the deep gashes. The bleeding slowed. He watched her, his gray eyes clouded with pain, but clear with a new understanding. Her small, competent hands, once raw from fumbling with a rabbit pelt, were now saving his life. She took the clean bandages he'd given her for her own hands and began to wrap his arm, her work tight and sure. "You," he rasped. "You hit it." Livia paused, her hands on the bandage. "You hit it with the branch." I think I heard it," she whispered. He said, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. "You did." He looked at the wrapped arm, then back at her face. The terror was gone from her eyes. In its place was a fierce, protective focus he had never seen there before. "You were good with the snares," he said, his voice soft, almost a different man's. "And you learned the rifle." I thought. "I was teaching you to be a survivor." He looked at the dead cougar visible through the open doorway. "I think," he said, "I just taught you how to be a hunter." He met her gaze. "You saved my life, Livia." She finished the knot, her hands shaking again. The ordeal finally catching up to her. He had given her a refuge. She had just defended it. She was no longer the girl he had rescued. He was no longer just her protector. They were something else. They were partners. They were a clan of two. The week that followed was a blur of fever and blood and exhaustion. Abel's wounds were deep, and despite the yarrow, the cat's claws had carried a sickness. The mountain man, who had seemed as indestructible as the granite peaks, was laid low. He spent 3 days lost in a delirium, his powerful body burning with infection. And in that time, Livia became his keeper. The roles, so starkly defined, were not just reversed, they were redrawn. She was no longer the student. She was the sole protector of their small, fragile world. She moved with a grim, focused efficiency. She fetched water, her legs burning on the repeated trips to the creek, but she did not falter. She kept the fire roaring, a bastion against the encroaching cold and the fever that chilled him from within. She checked his wounds with a clinical detachment she didn't know she possessed, cleaning them with boiled water and salt, reapplying the herbal poultices he had taught her to make. He would thrash in his fever, his voice, usually so quiet, now rough with pained murmurs. But he did not speak of the cougar. He spoke of a name, a ghost from his past. "Sarah," he'd groan, his eyes clenched shut. "I told you not to go. The ice." So thin. His pain was older, deeper than the fresh wounds on his arm. Livia didn't know who Sarah was. A wife? A sister? It didn't matter. She saw only the raw agony of a man who had failed to protect someone. She would place a cool, damp cloth on his forehead, her touch, once so tentative, now firm and steady. "Hush, Abel," she'd whisper, her voice the one he had used on her. "I'm here. You're safe. We are safe." She was not comforting a child. She was calming an equal, anchoring him to the present, to the warm cabin, away from the icy memories that haunted him. Survival, however, demanded more than vigil. They needed food. On the second day of his fever, she looked at the dwindling supply of dried meat. She looked at the heavy rifle, leaning against the wall. Her shoulder throbbed at the memory of its kick, but the fear was a dull, distant echo compared to the sharp, immediate need in front of her. She took down the rifle. She checked the load, as he had taught her. She put on his oversized winter coat, the one he'd been wearing when the cat attacked. The left sleeve was shredded, stiff with his dried blood. She put it on anyway, a strange, grim armor. She stepped out into the bright, silent snow. The world was terrifying. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of yellow eyes. Every snap of a frozen twig made her heart leap, but she did not run back. She walked, placing her feet carefully, her head on a constant swivel, her senses straining. "You are a living thing, same as the hawk." She made her way to the snares. The first, his, empty. The second, hers, empty. The third, hers. She saw it from a distance. The loop was gone, the trigger stick sprung, her heart hammered. There, half buried in a drift, was a snowshoe hare, white and still. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She retrieved it, her hands shaking, and reset the trap with practiced motions. She did not return to the cabin. She took a deep breath, clutched the rifle, and forced herself to walk the full line. When she returned an hour later, she carried not just the hare, but a grim, vital knowledge. She had faced the wilderness alone, and she had won. Abel was awake when she returned. The fever had not broken, but his eyes were open. lucid, though clouded with pain. He saw her enter, the rifle in one hand, the hair in the other. He saw his own bloody coat draped over her small shoulders. He said nothing, but his eyes. His eyes followed her as she moved to the hearth, as she began to skin the animal with a sure, practiced hand. A new respect, a profound and weary understanding passed between them. He had seen her as a victim. He had trained her as a survivor. He now saw her as a provider. On the fourth day, the fever broke. He woke to the smell of a thin, savory broth. Livia was asleep, not in her furs, but on the stool by his bed, her head slumped on her knees. The rifle was not on the wall. It was leaning against the stool, within her reach. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the smudge of soot on her cheek, the way her small hand was clenched even in sleep. She had been guarding him. She had been guarding them both. His recovery was slow, a humiliation for a man who had never known weakness. He, who could carry a deer carcass for miles, now needed her help just to sit up. He, who had wrestled a cougar, now found his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold a spoon. He was gruff. He was angry. He was ashamed. "I can do it," he would growl, as she tried to help him with a bandage. "I know," she'd say, her voice calm, and she would gently but firmly push his fumbling hand aside. "But you don't have to. Not today." Her patience was not the fawning pity of a nurse. It was the steady, practical care of a partner. She did not coddle him. She tended to him as she tended the fire. As she reset the traps, it was a job that needed doing, and she would do it right. The silence in the cabin became a new thing. It was no longer the quiet of a teacher and a student. It was the shared silence of two people who had seen each other's deepest vulnerabilities. He found himself talking, filling the quiet, not with orders, but with observations. "The wind's from the east," he'd say, his voice still rough. "It'll bring more snow. Check the chinking by the window." It was a command, but it was also a lesson. "The gray jays are back," she'd reply, looking out the small window. "They know you're getting better. They're waiting for scraps." He looked at her, surprised. She was reading The Mountain, too. One afternoon, he was strong enough to sit on the stool by the open door, the weak winter sun on his face. She was outside, practicing with the rifle. Not firing, just sighting, aiming. The motions he had drilled into her, until the heavy weapon felt like a part of her. "Your father," he said, the words abrupt. Elvia froze, her back to him. "What did he do to you?" She turned, slowly. The question was not born of pity, but of a need to understand. He needed me to be weak," she said, the words tasting like ash. "He needed me to be afraid." It was how he knew he was strong. Abel looked down at his own bandaged arm, at the hands that had taken a life, that had saved one. "The mountain is the opposite," he said. "It needs you to be strong. It doesn't care if you're afraid, only that you act." He met her eyes. "You are not weak, Livia." A month after the attack, he was healed, save for a network of livid, purple scars that crisscrossed his arm. He was splitting wood again. His strength returned. Livia was in the cabin, kneading bread. The flour he had bought on that fateful day was almost gone, but she had learned to mix it with meal ground from cattail roots, as he'd shown her. The cabin was no longer his den. It was theirs. Her touch was everywhere. The furs were aired and piled neatly. The herbs were arranged in tidy bundles. There were even 2 tin cups on the shelf he had never owned. She had salvaged them from a trader's old, abandoned pack she'd found. The cabin felt brighter. It felt full. He came in, his arms full of firewood, and stopped. She was humming, a low, tuneless sound, a sound of simple, quiet contentment. He had never heard her make a sound that wasn't born of fear or effort. Livia, seeing him stare, blushed and fell silent. It's a song my mother used to hum," she stammered, her hands stilling in the dough. He didn't speak. He just watched her for a moment, then set the wood down by the hearth. He walked to the table. He looked at her hands, white with flour. He reached out, not to her arm, not to her shoulder, and gently, with one calloused finger, brushed a stray bit of flour from her cheek. It was the first time he had touched her in gentleness. Elvia's breath caught. He let his hand drop. "It's a good sound," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The cabin. It's been quiet for too long." He turned away, but not before she saw it. A faint, real smile, one that reached his gray, stormy eyes. It was not the grin of a hunter. It was the smile of a man who was, after a long, hard winter, finally home. The spring thaw came not as a gentle melt, but as a violent cracking. The mountain shook off its heavy mantle of snow in a series of avalanches and roaring, new-found creaks. The world, which had been silent and white, was now loud, with the sound of rushing water and dripping pine. The cabin, their fortress, had held. The partnership forged in the crucible of the cougar attack and the long, fevered recovery had solidified into something as strong as the granite peaks. They were no longer protector and victim. They were a unit. Livia moved with a quiet confidence, her body stronger from a winter of hard labor. The hollows in her cheeks were gone, replaced by the healthy glow of mountain air. The terror that had lived in her eyes for a decade was gone, replaced by a calm, watchful focus. She had learned the mountain's language, and it had, in turn, claimed her as its own. Abel, too, had changed. The scars on his arm were a daily reminder, not of his weakness, but of her strength. He no longer moved with the solitary grace of a lone hunter. He moved as half of a whole. He would pause in his work, listening for the sound of her humming, a sound that had become as much a part of the cabin as the crackle of the fire. The profound, grieving silence he had wrapped around himself for years had been broken, filled by her presence. He found himself speaking, telling her of the coming seasons, of the habits of the elk, of the stories his own people told of the stars. He was teaching her not just to survive, but to belong. He had gone to check his long-range traps, a 2-day journey to the far ridge, the first he had taken since the cougar. The thaw meant the pelts would be turning, and it was the last harvest before the lean summer. He was tracking a lynx when he found the trail. It was not one, but many. Shod horses, not the unshod ponies of the Ute who sometimes passed through, and they were clumsy, the riders unused to the high terrain. They had camped here, just below the ridge, and left a mess tins, a broken whiskey bottle, the ashes of a carelessly large fire. They were white men, town men. He knelt, his eyes tracing their path. They were not hunting. They were not trapping. They were scouting. They were moving in a pattern, a clumsy, searching grid. They were looking for his cabin. He abandoned his traps and ran, his long, loping stride eating up the miles, his heart a cold stone in his chest. Below, in Dry Gulch, Malachi Stone had also endured a long winter, but his had not been one of healing. It had been a season of simmering, poisonous rage. He had stumbled back to town, his body broken, his authority shattered. The townsfolk who had once feared him now looked at him with a new, dangerous pity. They had seen him bested. They had seen his daughter walk away. His ledger book, his only true weapon, had lost its power. Humiliation was a more potent fuel than greed. He could not abide her choice. He could not tolerate her freedom. In his dark, twisted mind, it was not an escape, it was a theft. That savage, that godless animal had stolen his property. He spent the winter in the saloon, not drinking, but poisoning. He wove a new narrative, his voice low and reasonable, full of feigned, fatherly grief. He spoke of his gentle, confused daughter, bewitched by a wild brute. He painted Kincaid as a kidnapper, a beast who had taken a civilized Christian girl to his den. He was not a man, he was a monster. And Malachi, he was just a grieving father. desperate to save his child's life and her very soul. He didn't go to the sheriff. The law was a tool for the weak. He went to the men who owed him, the men with nothing to lose, the men who feared his ledgers more than they feared the law. He opened his book, and one by one, he called them in. To one, he offered to erase a gambling debt. To another, a line of credit for spring seed. To a third, a simple bounty in gold coin. He gathered a posse not of lawmen, but of desperate, cruel men, bound to him by their own failings. They were his to command. And as soon as the snows began to clear, he had sent them, his hounds, to find the trail. Kincaid burst into the cabin, his breathing hard, his face a grim mask. Livia, who was scrubbing the table, dropped the rag. She had never seen him run, had never seen this cold urgency in his eyes. "He's coming," Abel said. No other preface. "Who?" she whispered, though she already knew. "Your father." He laid his rifle on the table. "I found their tracks. 12 men, maybe more. They're scouting the ridges. They'll find this place by tomorrow, maybe the day after." He walked to the hearth, his movements tight, controlled. He was a predator, caged, pacing. "I can get you out. Tonight, we can use the old Ute Trail, cross the divide. By the time they find this cabin, we'll be 50 miles east. I can leave you in a real town. Silver Cliff, maybe. You'll be safe. You can start over." He was offering her the world he had left, the one she had fled. He was offering her escape. Again. Livia looked around the cabin, at her pile of furs, at the shelves she had so carefully organized, at the heavy rifle leaning by the door, at the man who was offering to give up his home, his life, to see her safe. She remembered the alley, the cold, the fear. She remembered the cougar, the blood, the fight. She was not the same person. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it had the unyielding strength of the mountain. Abel turned, his face a question. "No, you taught me the mountain is honest," she said, walking to the table. She picked up the skinning knife, its weight familiar, comfortable in her hand. "You taught me to survive. You taught me to fight. You said this is a place where you are what you do, not what someone calls you." She looked him in the eye. "I am not a victim. I am not a runaway. This is my home. You are my family." The word was a fragile, powerful thing, and she said it with a fierce certainty. "I will not run from him. Not again." Abel Kincaid looked at her for a long, silent moment. He saw the girl he had pulled from the alley, but she was gone. In her place stood a woman, forged in the same wild, honest fire that had forged him. The last of his own loneliness, the last shadow of the ghost named Sarah. Finally, "Riku." He nodded. "Then we fight." The tone shifted. The air in the cabin became sharp, electric. They were no longer a guardian and a ward. They were a garrison. "They'll come from the south," he said, his voice all strategy. "It's the only way up for horses." "The creek bed," Livia said instantly. "It's the shallowest crossing, but it's a bottleneck. They'll be exposed." He looked at her, a flash of genuine pride in his eyes. "Aye. But they'll send men on foot through the timber to flank us. From the east. That's where you'll be." He went to his workbench, his movements fast, precise. He pulled out his second rifle, the one she had trained with, and a heavy pistol. He began checking the loads, laying out boxes of ammunition. "We won't stay in the cabin, it's a trap. A wooden box. We fight from the rocks. From the high ground." He handed her the rifle and the pistol. "You will go to the high ledge, the one where the eagles nest. You can see the timberline from there. You will fire, and you will move. Never fire from the same place twice. You are not fighting to kill them all. You are fighting to break them. To make them believe the mountain itself is against them." Livia took the weapons. Their weight was real, solid. "And you? I'll take the pass. I'll make them pay for every step they take into our home." The chapter of her healing was over. The chapter of her war had begun. They spent the last hours of daylight not in panic, but in methodical preparation. They moved food, water, and ammunition to the high ledge, and to the rocks overlooking the pass. They barred the cabin door, but left the chimney smoking, a defiant invitation. Let them think they were cowering inside. As dusk fell, they stood together on the high ledge, looking down at the valley that had become their world. The first stars were appearing. The air was cold and still. "I'm afraid, Abel," she whispered, not in shame, but as a simple statement of fact. He put his scarred hand on her shoulder. "Good," he rumbled. "Fear keeps you sharp. Fear keeps you alive. You've earned this fear. Now, use it." He gave her shoulder a single, hard squeeze. "I will draw their fire. Do not show yourself until they are in the timber. Hold your ground, Livia." "Hold the ground," she repeated. He nodded, and like a shadow, he was gone, melting into the rocks, moving toward the pass. Livia was alone, on the high ledge, with a rifle, a pistol, and a clear view of the killing ground. She was no longer waiting for her father's hand. She was waiting for his posse. The first sound was not the crack of a rifle, but the clumsy clatter of a shod horse on loose shale, far below. It was followed by the low, angry murmur of men. Livia lay flat on the high ledge, her body pressed against the cold granite. She did not need to see. She could hear them, a dozen clumsy, loud intruders, dragging the corruption of the town up into the clean silence. The moon was a sliver, offering just enough light to make the shadows deep and treacherous. She watched the creek bed, a dark slash in the landscape below. Then, a spark. Someone, a fool, had lit a lantern. It bobbed in the darkness, a single point of yellow light. "Put that out, you idiot," a voice hissed. It was her father's. The sound sent a jolt of icy adrenaline through her, but the fear was different now. It was not the passive terror of a victim. It was the sharp, cold focus of a hunter. The light vanished, followed by a curse and a splash. They were at the crossing. From the rocks across the pass, a single shot exploded. The sound was deafening. The muzzle flashed a brilliant, violent flower in the dark. It was followed by the high-pitched scream of a man, not in pain, but in pure terror, and the panicked whinny of a horse. Abel had fired. He had not aimed to kill. He had aimed to break them. "He's up there," another voice shouted. "In the rocks." Several rifles answered, their shots blind, sparks flying as bullets ricocheted off the granite walls of the pass. They were shooting at a ghost. Livia smiled, a grim, wolfish baring of teeth. She turned her attention to the timberline on her right. Her father was not stupid. He would not send all his men into the bottleneck. She waited. The forest was dark, a solid wall of black. She listened, tuning out the chaos from the pass. She heard nothing, but she felt them. A subtle shift in the air, the sense of movement. Do not be seen. She scanned the edge of the trees, her eyes slowly adjusting, and then she saw him. A dark shape moving low, detaching itself from the shadow of a large spruce, then another and another. 4 men. They were moving towards the path that led up to the cabin, trying to flank Abel's position. They were moving right into her sights. Livia chambered around. The snick of the bolt was a small, perfect mechanical sound. She rested the heavy barrel on the rock, just as he had taught her. She sighted on the last man, the one furthest back. She did not aim for his chest. She aimed for the rock, just in front of his feet. She pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. A familiar, powerful punch. The shot cracked. The man screamed as rock shards and lead spattered his legs. He fell, howling, clutching his shins. "Ambush!" he shrieked. "We're flanked! They're in the trees!" The other 3 men scattered, diving for cover, firing blindly into the timber. But they were firing at the wrong place. They were firing where she was, not where she was going. Livia was already moving, crab walking backwards, staying low, putting 20 feet of solid rock between her and her last position. From the pass, Abel's rifle spoke again. Another shout. The men in the creek bed were in chaos, caught between the echo of her shot from above and his from the front. They were trapped. "He's just one man," she heard her father roar, his voice cracking with rage. "He's one man! Move, you cowards, or you'll get no pay!" One of the men in the timber, braver than the others, got to his feet. "I see him," he lied, raising his rifle toward Abel's last muzzle flash. "I'll get the Livia," from her new position. Fired again. She did not wait. She did not aim to wound. She aimed for the center of his mass. The man grunted a heavy, wet sound and collapsed. He did not get up. Silence. The shooting from the timber stopped. The men were pinned down, terrified. One down, one wounded. From the pass, her father's voice was a frantic scream. "Where is she? Find the girl. She's the one in the rocks. She's up high." Livia felt a cold thrill. He had recognized her. He knew, in that moment, that the creature he had tried to break was now the one holding the high ground. "Come and find me," she whispered to the wind. She moved again, crawling through a narrow cleft in the rock that led to another overlook. She could see the pass now. She saw the main group of men, huddled behind their horses, trapped. And she saw Abel. He was moving, a shadow among shadows, relocating to a higher position. He was drawing their fire, a one-man army, making them believe he was everywhere at once. But Malachi was moving too. He was not with his men. He was using the chaos, just as she was. He was slipping away from the main group, climbing the rocks on the far side, alone, his eyes fixed on the ledge he knew she must be on. He was coming for her. He had always been coming for her. This was not about the posse. This was not about Abel. This was what it had always been. Him and her. A new, cold fear gripped her. This was not the mountain. This was the alley. All over again, but 1,000 feet up. She raised her rifle, her hands shaking, and tried to find him in the darkness. But he was gone, swallowed by the rocks. "Abel!" she screamed, her voice a desperate warning. "He's coming! He's on the rocks!" Abel heard her. He fired one last time into the pass, then began to climb, moving parallel to Malachi, trying to cut him off. But he was too far below. It was a race, and her father had the shorter path. Livia scrambled back, her heart hammering. She was at the top of the ledge, a small, flat space, the eagle's nest. Behind her was a sheer, 50-foot drop. In front of her was the path from the timber. And climbing up that path, his face a pale mask of hate in the moonlight, was Malachi Stone. He was not carrying a rifle. He was carrying the heavy pistol from his belt. "I knew it," he hissed, pulling himself up onto the ledge. He was 10 yards away. "I knew you were up here. Did you really think you could hide from me, girl? Did you think that animal could protect you?" Livia raised her rifle, but her hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold it. This was not a target. This was not a shadow. This was her father. "Stay back," she said, her voice a reedy, pathetic sound. I'll shoot." "No, you won't," he sneered, taking a slow step. "You won't. You're weak. You've always been weak. You're mine. You were born mine, and you'll die mine." He took another step. "You're just like your mother, a disobedient, worthless wretch." Livia pulled the trigger. The hammer clicked on an empty chamber. She had fired her last shot. She stared at the rifle in her hands, her mind blank with panic. Malachi laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "See? Useless." He raised his pistol not to shoot, but to point. "Now, you're going to come with me. We're going to go home. And you are going to learn, finally, what obedience means." He lunged, grabbing the front of her coat, the material he himself had bought. She screamed and fell backward, the rifle clattering on the stone. She kicked, but he was too strong. He was dragging her toward the path, back down into the life she had escaped. "No!" she cried, clawing at the rock. Abel! He can't hear you! Malachi snarled, striking her across the face. The blow was a familiar, sickening crack. The world exploded in white light. He's dead. They're all dead. It's just you and me now, like it always should have been. He was on top of her, his weight crushing, his hand on her throat, the smell of whiskey and rage on his breath. She was back in the alley. She was weak. She was trapped. She was going to die. But as her vision began to narrow, as the cold rock pressed against her back, she remembered. Control it. Don't let it control you. She was not in the alley. She was on the mountain. And she was not unarmed. Her hand, trapped beneath him, fumbled at her belt, her fingers closing not on the heavy pistol she'd dropped, but on the cold, familiar haft of her skinning knife. With the last of her strength, she twisted, plunging the blade, not with the slash of a victim, but with the deep, powerful, upward thrust of a hunter. Malachi's body went rigid. His grip on her throat loosened. He made a sound, a short, wet gasp of surprise. He looked down, at the handle of the knife buried to the hilt just under his ribs. He looked at her, his eyes wide, not with rage, but with a terrible, final confusion. "Livia?" he whispered. And then he collapsed, his dead weight falling across her. For a long moment, there was no sound but the high, thin ringing in her ears and the wind sighing over the ledge. Livia lay on the cold stone, the dead weight of her father a suffocating blanket. Then, with a desperate, guttural sob, she shoved, rolling the body off her. It came to rest a few feet away, his pistol still clenched in his cooling hand, his eyes open to the empty, uncaring stars. She was alive. She was breathing. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. But she was alive. From below, from the timberline, came the sounds of pure panic. The remaining posse members, having heard their leader's final desperate charge, the shriek, and then the terrible final silence, had broken. They were not fighting a mountain man. They were fighting ghosts. They were fighting a girl who had risen from the dead. They were crashing back through the woods, falling over each other, their only thought to escape this haunted, cursed mountain. The sound of their retreat faded, swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The battle was over. Livia pushed herself into a sitting position, her back against the rock. She still held the knife, her small hand locked around the handle, sticky and warm. She stared at it, at the dark blood, and a wave of nausea and revulsion so profound it made her choke, washed over her. She had done it. She had survived. But the cost was this. She had taken a life. The sound of a boot scraping on rock made her spin around, her arm raising the knife, a cornered animal ready to strike again. Abel Kincaid pulled himself up onto the ledge. He was breathing hard, his good arm raw from the climb. He froze when he saw her. He looked at the body of Malachi Stone. He looked at the bloody knife in her hand. He looked at her face, streaked with tears and gunpowder, her eyes wide and wild. He did not look shocked. He did not look horrified. He looked, to her surprise, like a man who had just seen the sunrise. He walked over to her slowly. He did not reach for her, did not try to take the knife. He simply knelt in front of her, his gray eyes searching hers. "Livia," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. He reached out, not to her hand, but to the ugly red mark on her cheek where her father had struck her one last time. He gently brushed his thumb over it. "Are you hurt?" The simple question, the simple, gentle touch, broke her. The knife fell from her numb fingers, clattering onto the stone. The high, vibrating strength that had held her together for the fight vanished, and she collapsed, folding in on herself, sobbing. Great, ragged, tearing sounds that seemed to be ripped from her very soul. Abel Kincaid did not try to stop her. He did not offer empty words. He simply sat there, a solid, unmovable presence, and let her grieve. He let her break. He let the years of poison, of fear, of pain, finally come flooding out. He sat with her, a guardian, as the last of the girls she had been died, and the woman she had become was born in its place. When the sobs finally quieted, when she was left empty and gasping in the cold night air, he held out his good hand. "Come," he said, "let's go home." She looked at his hand, scarred and strong. She placed her own, small and bloody, into it. He pulled her to her feet. They stood together, two survivors, on the high ledge. He looked at Malachi's body one last time. "The mountain reclaims everything," he said. He did not need to say more. He kept her hand in his and led her off the ledge, back down the narrow path, leaving the past behind in the cold, high rocks. They returned to the cabin as the first pale gray light of dawn touched the eastern peaks. The cabin, which had been a fortress, was now truly a sanctuary. The fire was low, but the embers still glowed. Abel sat her on the stool, the one she had perched on so nervously that first night. He stoked the fire, his movements slow, weary. He was hurt, she realized. His climb had torn at his wounds. He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw the true depth of the exhaustion in his face. They were both at the end of their strength. But for the first time, they were not alone in it. A new, quiet ritual began. He brought the wash basin. He gently took her hands, her face, and washed away the blood and the grime. Then she, in turn, took the cloth. "Your arm," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. She unwrapped the new bandages, which were stained with fresh blood. She cleaned his wounds, her touch steady. They were two healers, mending the damage the world had inflicted. They did not speak. They did not need to. Every touch was a word. Every shared look was a sentence. "We are alive. We survived. We are here." They slept for a day and a night, a profound, healing sleep. When they woke, the sun was high, the air was warm, and the world was starting over. The next week was one of hard, shared labor. It was a cleansing. They did not speak of the fight. They spoke of the tasks. Together, they cleared the pass of the debris of the battle. An abandoned rifle, a spilled bag of shot. The mountain, as Abel had said, reclaimed its own. The men who had fallen were gone, taken by the silent, efficient predators of the high country. Malachi Stone was gone. They worked side by side, repairing the cabin door, which one of the posse had splintered with a stray shot. They restacked the woodpile. They reset the trap lines. It was not his work. With her helping, it was their work. Spring truly arrived. A sudden glorious burst of green. The creeks ran full, and the aspens unfurled tiny, trembling leaves. Livia found a small, sunlit patch of earth behind the cabin, protected by a high wall of rock. She took a shovel, and with an aching back, she turned the soil. She found a small, forgotten cloth bag among the supplies Kincaid had bought on that last trip to town. Seeds, turnips, beans, hardy squash. She planted a garden. It was a defiant act of hope, a promise of a future, a root driven deep into the soil of her new home. Abel watched her from a distance, his heart aching with a feeling he had not known for a decade. He had buried a family once. He had never thought to have another. He had come to the mountain to be alone, to let his grief carve him into stone. But this girl, this small, terrified, resilient creature, had broken him open. She had reminded him that the strongest thing on the mountain was not the rock. It was the tiny, stubborn seed that broke the rock to find the sun. He walked over to her. She looked up, wiping sweat from her brow with a dirty hand. "It's good soil," she said. I think things will grow here." He knelt beside her in the dirt. He reached out and, with a calloused finger, touched one of the small, green shoots that was just beginning to push through. "Yes," he rumbled, his voice thick. "They will." That evening, they sat on the bench he had built outside the door, watching the sky turn a deep, bruised purple. The air was soft. "He said I was like my mother," Livia said quietly, her voice no longer holding the tremor of fear. He said she was weak. Abel looked at the peaks, now catching the last, fiery light of the sun. He was a fool, he said. He looked at a willow and called it weak because it bent in the wind. He did not see the strength in its roots which hold the bank together. He did not understand that which endures is stronger than that which only breaks. He turned to her. You are not weak, Livia. You are the strongest person I have ever known. You are like the mountain. You endure. He reached over and took her hand. His scarred, rough palm enveloped hers. It was not a gesture of ownership or even of passion. It was a simple, profound statement of fact, a connection, a partnership. I came here, he said, his voice a low rumble, because the silence of my own heart was too loud. I thought I was meant to be a ghost. He looked at their joined hands. You taught me how to live again. Livia leaned her head against his solid shoulder. The shadow of her father was gone, burned away by the clean, honest light of the high country. The terror from the alley was a distant, faded scar. She was not a prisoner. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. She was a hunter. She was home. You were just waiting, Abel, she whispered. We both were. They sat in the quiet, the first stars appearing over the ridge. Below them, the world of men, of towns, of cruelty and ledgers, was a distant, unimportant dream. Above them, the vast, silent, honest sky. In the small cabin, a single lamp glowed, a beacon of warmth, a fortress built by two outcasts, a home. The mountain man had not just saved her, she had saved him. And together, in the heart of the wilderness, they had found the one thing neither of them had ever truly known: peace. The first snow of the next winter found a different world on the high plateau. The cabin was no longer a den. It was a home. The small garden Livia had carved from the rocky soil had yielded a surprisingly robust harvest of beans, turnips, and squash, which now hung drying from the rafters, alongside the bundles of herbs and cured meats. She had sewn new curtains for the single window out of a clean flour sack, and the heavy bear hide that had been her first bed was now a rug in front of the hearth, a place they shared in the evenings. The space was no longer just Abel's, stark and functional. It was theirs, filled with the small, sturdy comforts of a shared life. Livia moved through the new-fallen snow with an easy, silent grace. She was returning from checking the lower trap lines, the heavy rifle resting comfortably in the crook of her arm, two fat hairs tied to her belt. The 18 months since her father's death had remade her. The wind and the work had sculpted her, stripping away the last vestiges of the pale, hollow-eyed town girl. Her body was strong, her movements sure. The fear that had been her constant companion for a decade was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet watchfulness. She did not just survive on the mountain. She understood it. She was a part of its rhythm. She saw the smoke from the cabin chimney rising in a straight, clean line, and a small, unconscious smile touched her lips. She crested the final rise and saw him. Abel was standing by the newly built corral, mending a section of fence, his back to her. He was not the solitary, grieving ghost he had been. The weight he had carried, the shadow of the past, had lifted. He moved with a purpose that was no longer just about survival. It was about building. He heard her step, the soft crunch of her moccasin, and he turned. The man who had never smiled, whose face had been a mask of granite, looked at her, and his eyes softened. A slow, real smile spread across his face, a gesture of pure, quiet welcome. "Good hunting," he rumbled, his voice lacking the sharp edge it once had. "The snow brought them out," she replied, her own voice low and steady. She unslung the rifle, her movements practiced, and leaned it against the cabin wall before holding up the hairs. "I thought, stew, with the last of the turnips." "Good," he said. "Good, I'll finish this." The woods stacked. Their life was a quiet, constant conversation, spoken in tasks shared and needs anticipated. He no longer issued commands. they simply moved in concert. He was the brute strength, the one who could fell a tree. She was the quickness, the one with the sharp eyes who could spot a deer a mile off. He was the foundation, she was the fire. 2 months ago, they had gone down to Dry Gulch. It was the first time she had set foot in the town since the day she'd walked away. The winter would be long, and they needed powder, lead, and a new axe head. Abel had asked, his voice quiet, "You don't have to go. I can trade." She had looked at him, surprised. Then she had nodded, her resolve hardening. "No, I'll go." The town was just as she remembered, dusty, small, and mean. But she was different. She walked beside Abel, not behind him. She wore the buckskin trousers and tunic he had made for her, her hair tied back with a leather thong. She carried her own knife openly at her belt. When they walked into the mercantile, the talk stopped. The men at the stove went silent. They stared. The new proprietor, a nervous man from back east, fumbled with their order. Livia met their stares. She looked at the townsfolk, one by one, her gaze as cold and clear as the mountain air. She saw no pity in their eyes now. She saw fear. She saw a strange, grudging respect. They were not looking at Livia Stone, the victim. They were looking at Kincaid's woman, the girl who had survived the wilderness, the girl who had faced her father and a dozen armed men, and who had returned. She was a myth now, just as Abel was. She was the mountain. She had not found her voice to shout at them. She had found something far more powerful, the calm, unshakable certainty of who she was. She was not theirs to judge. That night, back in the safety of the cabin, she had been quiet. Abel watched her as she added wood to the fire. "It was smaller than I remembered," she said, her voice soft. "The houses, the street, it all seemed so small." Abel had nodded, understanding. "You're seeing it from the high country now. It's hard to go back to the basin." Now, as the winter closed in around them, they were prepared. They were a fortress, not of stone and wood, but of shared will. Livia skinned the hares, her hands quick and sure, the motions as familiar as breathing. Abel came in, stamping the snow from his boots, bringing a gust of cold, clean air with him. He hung his heavy coat on its peg. He watched her for a moment, the rhythm of her work. "You're good with that blade," he said. "You taught me," she replied, not looking up. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I taught you how to hold it. The mountain taught you how to use it." He walked to the fire, warming his scarred hand. The wounds, once so livid, had faded to pale, silvery lines, a map of their shared past. "I had a wife once," he said, his back to her. Livia's hands stilled. He had never spoken the name Sarah. He had never spoken of his past. She died on the ice. A long time ago. I came here because I thought I had failed her. I thought I was only good at letting things die." He turned, his gray eyes clear, the old storm in them finally, truly, gone. "I was wrong. I was just waiting for a lesson. I thought I was teaching you how to survive, Livia." He looked around the warm, full cabin, at her. "But you were teaching me how to live." Livia felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She was not the girl he had rescued. She was the woman who had helped him heal. He was not the savior who had pulled her from the alley. He was the man who had given her the tools to save herself. She finished her work and came to stand beside him at the hearth. Outside, the wind began to rise. The first real storm of the season, a high, lonely howl. But inside, there was only the steady crackle of the fire, the smell of the coming stew, and the quiet, shared breath of two people who were exactly where they were supposed to be. Abel Kincaid, the grizzly, the mountain man, looked at the woman beside him. She was not a victim. She was not a daughter. She was his partner. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused, scarred fingers lacing with hers. "It will be a hard winter," he said. She leaned her head against his solid shoulder. strong, free, and unafraid. "We're ready for it," she said. And they stood there together, two solitary souls who had found a home, not in the towns of men, but in the honest, unyielding heart of the wilderness. They had faced the past and buried it, and now, under the vast, silent, watching sky, they had finally, completely, found their peace. The mountain path is steep, and the night is cold, but as Abel and Livia learned, no one has to walk it alone. Their story is about finding strength, not in isolation, but in the courage to protect another. It's a story of healing, of finding a home in a heart that was just as broken as your own. Here, we believe those are the only stories worth telling. If you believe in the power of redemption, if you believe the strongest families are the ones we find in the wild, then we ask you to join our community. Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss a journey. Tell us in the comments below, what does the word home truly mean to you? We'll see you in the next story on Here from the Mountains.